Welcome back to High Performance Computing, our lecture 4 on Advanced MPI Techniques. So we learned in the first part of this lecture that MPI is a very broad standard, really. It covers a lot of ground and lots of, different functions that in one respect we just covered on essentially a high level point of view. So there will be many blocking versus non-blocking functions. And of course, the blocking ones you have here and there already realized in one of the previous lectures with MPI send, MPI receive. But then there are also this non-blocking asynchronous communication ideas of basically using I send and so forth, and I receive and so forth. But this will be also material in subsequent lectures at this part of the assignment, because I think the best way to understand it is really doing it practically yourself, using maybe MPI wait statements. And then later we learned about the MPI barrier synchronization methods, because if you start non-blocking communication, things are getting a little bit out of hand, right? It's not as simple as ping and pong that we learned in lecture 2 and 3 and so forth. So the parallelization domain decomposition is not that straightforward anymore. The processes will go along. So you have to basically deal with that. But on the other hand, of course, it means that the waiting time where processes don't do anything, which we don't want in HPC, they should be working, they should be doing computing, is of course reduced. So non-blocking communication is of course good, but for programming perspective, it could be also here and there leading to performance issues. And those we will also think about in subsequent lectures when we have performance analysis and performance measurements with the profiling interface, and then performance analysis to tools like Scalable, for instance. So now we're talking about having basically a more view on MPI, but from a certain of different perspective. In the first part, we learned MPI and communication and computing. And the communication, then we realized that topologies matters, of course, the really physical interconnect matters. The cables in the end are one of the most expensive part of a HPC system. Perhaps today, alongside the amount of accelerators you can put in from NVIDIA, like in A100 cards, and in the future with some other, let's say, vendors that go into this domain. But still, this lecture today here, the second part, will be more focusing on what's happening with the data. So input, output, I/O is a very important topic. And when we do parallel computing, what we can learn about parallel I/O techniques. Now, again, that means we shift the view. So you can imagine that basically in the first part of the lecture, we were drawing attention a little bit to these interconnects here, which means InfiniBand, if you remember, that we had here and so on, busy HDR and stuff like this. But now we shift the view again, not only on this interconnects, which is important now, instead of just the computing and cores. Now we're thinking with all these cores, what data they locally compute, what we do, right? This is a natural next question. So why we should compute all of this when we cannot handle the data? And basically, here we have to say that, of course, this is an interesting question, and we can imagine that if you scale higher and higher, the data will be larger and larger. So where are the bottlenecks? Why we have to think about this? Sometimes we even call that data-driven applications today, because the amount of computing that you have there to compute is basically not the biggest issue, but the kind of output they produce. Think about CFD or computational fluid dynamic simulations in the terabytes that you do again and again and again. Will basically have some I/O requirements. You need to store this long term. So we talk about very large ideas of computing today in order to fix that problem. And really then thinking how we can deal with this, and in a very high performance way. Then some of these problems we will learn or basically know from the HPC application perspective are basically the I/O bound problems that in the end, the computing is not anymore the biggest problem. You think about much more that I/O really dominates the overall execution time. And with this, in the end, you have to really think about what your I/O strategy is, because it's really important for the overall performance. And especially if you deal with very large amounts of data that are basically put here a little bit. When you have small amounts of data, many of the things in this lecture is not so relevant, but usually we will say that high performance computing always had big problems to solve. And with this big problems, automatically we have big data along the way. However, big data as such can be understood in many different ways. And many of you know that you have been part of my cloud computing and big data course, where we learned this, especially with an emphasis maybe on parallel and scalable machine and deep learning. So more data intensive problems than we have here in the course, which is more on physical problems and, basically numerical problems and so forth, which the second part of the lecture series suggests. But still, some of these problems are actually equally shared. So I also encourage you to take maybe a view on these cloud computing course if you're interested, because there are much more data intensive elements in it. So we have here the idea then of data intensive problems on a very specific way, so to speak, as you would say as a researcher. And think about this, that we have this interesting element of high performance computing, that it must be fast all the time. We had the idea that basically you see here the different outlets or the frames that we have here was basically distributed memory, and then some elements within the different distributed memory, but being essentially connected to some memory space, which makes it then maybe shared. But in the end, you always want to put something to disk, right? And this is an important consideration. So with this, of course, the question comes, who is responsible for this? Who is actually now taking care that data is written to disk? And how I actually do this from the MPI world. When I do this now and say MPI automatically parallelize it with my MPI environment, with init and basically finalize. And in between, I have the same program just executed several times on different cores. So there must be a certain way of handling this I/O problems, which brings us to this parallel I/O. And then, of course, automatically under the distributed underlying file system issues, which we also partly cover in the cloud computing big data course, if you're interested. But otherwise, of course, here we will go into some certain elements of this much more in detail. And the I/O patterns can be very different. You can imagine, and of course in the cloud computing course, we have this on a much more variety, where we think about what I/O really means, how often you will access the files in the future, how often you will basically thinking of them of being just an archive. Here you see a tertiary storage, basically somewhere maybe having a tape archive, while here you have really disks spinning, more or less, basically giving directly access to your application. So it all matters how you basically run your HPC application and what you would really require from this I/O performance. So there's a huge bandwidth of what you really mean with I/O. There's a huge bandwidth of saying how you deal if you want to read big data once for a big MPI application at the beginning, maybe from tapes. Because tapes usually have also the problem with high number of small files. If you want to take them from tape archives, it takes really long. So you're going to prepare that, and having this already for your number, of course, allocated in scheduling, right? Remember, scheduling is important in the HPC system. We learned that now, hopefully a lot in assignment 1, and also basically as part of my lectures, that you share the system with many others, you're scheduled. So at the time when your schedule is there, your time allocation is there, you want to make sure that all your data is existing. If you have it stored in this kind of, tape archives, which, Amazon and others from the cloud would call glacier, right? It's tape very deep in the glacier. So you really have to get it first out in order to compute on it, which makes it very cheap. But on the other hand, of course, you cannot directly compute on it and assume it's there. So you have to prepare that. So there are many I/O challenges we have to think about it, especially if you think about that we scale up more and more. So the number of files read or written by processes, of course, something which is a very important part to study in this. You know, if we think of filling a new complete HPC system, you have 500,000 and something more cores, and you want to all use them. And all of these cores want to drop to file, of course, what they computed, so results. So how we actually manage the scalability is one of the concerns of our I/O and one of the challenges. And in this sense, we want to really understand also the bottlenecks in some respects. So the parallel file system in one idea is essentially then what we think is something which supports the parallel processing, but is a very specific file system. So it is basically thinking more about file blocks, basically building on different ideas of a file that is essentially across multiple file system nodes. So it is essentially saying that a single file is totally distributed, which makes this file blocks. And in the other hand, it means that we have basically the advantage of writing still, so to speak, in a single file, and you have the combined bandwidth of many of these physical devices, really. But then, of course, the disadvantage is that the file system would think about it as there's lots of things coming, and of course, it's just if you know one disk fails, you will lose all the data. And what you normally would do is basically you think about RAID strategies in this, and there's also something what we do in the cloud computing much more. But basically, we learned that you, of course, have to keep different copies. And then it brings us to the Hadoop distributed file system, things we learn in the cloud computing course. Here, it's a little bit different. We think about a parallel file system that is, you know, and this big file that we have across all these different cores that is really broken into these blocks, and you can configure, of course, the size, and basically you have automatically stored this to a parallel file system, and then this file system has a so-called concurrent file access really implemented and understands it, so that basically all of the different processes can write to the same file in a concurrent manner. And I think this is a very important part, which brings us to this different file system which exists in this arena. We have the IBM Spectrum Scale, which was previously known as the General Parallel File System, GPFS, for quite a long time. And basically a Lenovo/IBM product, which is basically more and more moved from HPC to really the big data problems. You also learned in the previous lectures that IBM and Lenovo essentially stopped the Blue Gene series of computing and HPC, so that really focused their know-how here on this spectrum scale in big data and scaling and parallel file systems. There are some open source variants as well with OpenLuster. For instance, what is used quite a lot, and in previous times, people have thought about the parallel virtual file system. But I think the idea is here that you have an interesting specific file system. So you don't think about your traditional pure Unix file system anymore, or basically your Windows file system. So this is one that really understands the concurrency of every different file, meaning that all of these different cores are doing something in the same time. They all generate different data at the same time. And there will be some time where they do it and basically drop it to I/O and want to store it. And of course, here you have now 6 processes of MPI, maybe from 0 to 5. But think about always, we talk about scaling issues, right? So now I have a computing MPI application that maybe scales 1024 to 2048. And you can go on and go on. And then suddenly you have, let's say, multiple 10,000, of course, always wanting to write into one file. So quite a performance issue. Doing this locally doesn't really make sense for each of the processes because we have to combine it in sorts of sense. But of course, this would be one way of dealing with it. So in order to really enable this concurrent file access, there's a so-called two-level mapping implemented, where you have, of course, all the view of all these different threads running and all these different processes of writing into one single file. But this is just a logical file, really. It's not the same file, not the physical file, because this will be mapped to different I/O nodes, where then basically you have the real devices. So in other words, when you think about the application point of view, you have basically the idea of how it is computing in the terms of different cores here, and they drop the data, and they all will drop it to this binary logical file here. And the real mapping to, let's say, I/O nodes will be then taking place, which is a kind of two-level mapping, how it is done usually, so that basically all processes can access the same file at the same time. But it's just a logical file over really multiple I/O nodes that have to scale with your application domain problem. So that brings us to the more general striping techniques that is not very specific, usually for HPC. Also, it's basically striping that usually means that this one file you're talking about is split into some form of this specifically sized blocks that you need, and basically over different disks, which are then, of course, a really physical storage. And you can influence this with striping factors and striping units. And here and there, we'll do also some demonstrations on this. So I think it's not the most important part. Of course, you can trigger how much basically this stripes will be. And the parallel file success in the end is very different in a way from the typical things you know from the file system, which is always a sequential file system. And people of you here in the course that use, let's say, a text editor and edit a file, and then you open another text editor, open the same file, right? Now you come to the problem. You have this two text editors opening the same file. It's a bit simulating what I'm alluding to here, the parallel file access. And you will notice, no matter where you are on a Windows system, Mac system, it will notify you, the operating system, that there's something problematic, because you have two essentially different systems of applications, want to access the same file, running in different threads. This is a problem. And basically, we come to the same problem on a larger scale when we talk about this parallel file access. So we have the idea of the underlying idea, what is to do when you have, you specify a file name, of course, that's what you know, or some of you know that don't do pure app-based systems, but at least you have the so-called file control block that keeps track of it. So it knows what an inode is, it knows what a file name is, but in the end, this is something which is typical, very sequential, right? A very sequential file system. So thinking about the parallel I/O, you would break this down into smaller pieces and think about subset of blocks. And every file, so to speak, has then basically the requirement of having a file control block at every I/O node. And here we think about that this is, of course, something where you have to think about changing it to some specific file access paradigms, and to find this file control block in a large-scale system, and to write and read and maintain its integrity, directory structure, and so forth can be challenging. So basically, you come to lots of sorts of problems in the file creation. Think about that 2048 processors are now done with the first iteration, or let's say 500 iterations of the application, and all of them want to create the output, and all of them create a file. This is a big burden for the file system at the same time, more or less, and hence here we need a parallel file system. So still the question remains, when you write to one file, what about the so-called sequential consistency when you write this? Right? And this is something which is, of course, nicely handled in the parallel file systems, but is a problem usually when you have your two editors open and you edited the same file. You can imagine that essentially it will be always an overwriting, right, of this. And when you store the first one, the first editor put the hello world in, and then you have the second editor on the same file, but you wrote hello world in HPC. In the end, the sequential consistency will be big matters. So what matters what you did in time sequentially. And this is, of course, something that in the end can be translated, so to speak, in the parallel world. And of course, they should be appearing in this sequence, but it's also hard to really do this sequential consistency if you have, let's say, 1024 processes running. So in the end, you have this mapping from the compute nodes to the IO nodes that we discussed. And in the end, this parallel file system helps you with this, but there are also different options how you can realize it. So of course, what you know from your serial laptop is locking entire files, more or less. At least they will give you a hint when you open another text editor on this file and say, actually, you probably cannot save the data because it's open in another application. You can do relaxed consistency semantics, where in the end, you yourself are responsible. You don't take this, locking of files. So you're responsible yourself as a developer, and then having file partitions. So basically certain parts of it. But when you think about how you could solve that, when you think about MPI applications, is maybe to think about more the locations within this big file, which was a logical file in terms of realizing this IO burden of having all these processes scalable, talking to one set of data and to enable IO. Of course, when you have then the shared file pointer, the file pointer usually picks a part of the file where you then write in, is basically quite inefficient. Basically, you have some serialization of the request usually, and then you have certain inconsistencies. Always think about the seek and the write of certain locations. So here we basically also think about, better use different file pointers to enable this different seek and write operations. And of course, we have this specific aspects how to do this. In Unix, you know that already. Perhaps some of you with a pre-read, pre-write. But it's essentially saying that if we have one file from different processes here somewhere on the machine, we would first seek the location where we want to write the file and then write something in terms of lengths and so on into this file. So it's getting here to really basics of how you have bits and bytes stored and so on. And I don't want to make a long point with it because in the end it should be basics in computer science. But of course, this means a lot for MPI. This means a lot for storing results. When we talk about MPI, talk about also the hardware we discussed. So how high performant are we talking about this? So the network topologies maybe play a role in the first place when you go from a core to an IO node, or if you go from a core to enable this MPI-IO. And this is really the third part that I wanted to leave you here as part of the MPI advanced techniques. MPI-IO is a very strong standard to enable us with a parallel IO technique that is very well suited for parallel file systems, if they exist on the system, right? So of course, here we need really the software on both ends. MPI-IO can only be as good as there's a parallel file system on the other end. Still, of course, when you think about some of the parallel file formats are still standard. So even if you do it in serial and don't have a parallel file system, let's say you cannot afford the GPFS or the IBM Spectrum scale, and don't want to install Lustre or so, then you still basically are in the serial world. And with this, of course, are limited in one respect, but still can benefit from the parallel file formats. Hence, this would be one of the next steps to talk about as well, NetCDF and things like that. Now, let's motivate a little bit MPI-IO and the idea of doing IO in all of this IO intensive applications, which use MPI for message exchanges. That's what we have discussed now lengthily. But of course, for us, it's very important to understand if one of these threads or processes really have computed something, how I drop this to file, and how I do this in a scalable fashion, high performance. So here, the general idea is that firstly, there are different operation modes that we know already for spin blocking and non-blocking. But the good news is also that the MPI accepts this collective operation that we learned already. So this helps us a little bit to think about I/O of being a collective operation. Everybody after the first 10th or 20th times step really drops something to file. So then we can use maybe collective operations where every process is involved. It helps us with the parallelization. But it's basically the parallel I/O concept that we can basically thinking and moving from sending and receiving in a collective operation that we know to something we would call a writing and maybe receiving files, or writing and reading files, so to speak, which is almost similar in MPI. So, and it makes sense, of course. If you want to read a big file, you want to have 2048 processes and much more, maybe running directly from T0, from time zero. Why they basically need now a sequential idea of saying there's one core that distributes firstly the first 10 minutes all data to all the different processes. You want to read all at once from the file at the T0 in order to compute for T1, T2, where all this data is needed, etc. So this is a big picture of MPI. And of course, the cool thing really with MPI are these kind of advanced concepts where you have really almost standards in data structures, data types. You can handle a request in different, let's say, data types. And we will learn about this basically with data structures, also partly in lecture 5. I cannot put everything in lecture 4. But the nice thing is really, it takes the idea of the collectives we already established and maps it to MPI and the I/O problem. So when you think about here, to think about what these different options would mean if you would have now to do I/O and to motivate parallel I/O later, we just have a couple of slides on this. So think about now we have these different processes, and of course a serial I/O could mean that maybe one process is the master of writing to files on behalf of many processes. So it will be getting all the different message exchanges. So that will take time, especially in the high scalability application. So they will all deliver to this processor, here to this example, process 5 if you want. But you immediately get the story that this is absolutely not scalable. Not only with the time increase in the amount of data here, also about the memory size, maybe the I/O, basically the capability to do I/O and to collect all this data of this one processor would not even be possible, right? So this is something what we call serial I/O. It would be basically not really scalable and usable, and it's probably also very slow, because in the end, if you have a parallel application and P5 is now receiving all of this, that is good. And of course, these processes have perhaps nothing else to do first. And then this poor processor here has to drop everything to file from all of those. So quite some load imbalance risk that you have with it. Now, the other way of the equation, would you say, what enables full parallel I/O would be, why not every processor takes it decentralized? So basically write your own file actually per process. So that's definitively possible, right? You think about all of them doing in some form of time computing and then want to do the I/O, just drop it to disk at every point in time. And then you have the disk having lots of local or process local files. And here we would think like, it might be running well if you have just this 5 processors. It might be running well if you have 512 something processors. But if you immediately come to 1024 or much more processes, you will realize that actually the file system is dealing with a so-called contention. we always thinking about another inode here in the world of Unix, where these most file system exist. For the Windows users, it's meaning that we create a new file with new metadata, with a new entry in the file system structure, which is fine if you click new file in your local text editor on a laptop. But think about scalability, right? Hence, I put this picture in. So if you have 500,000 processes running for an application, and that's what we do in applications, right? That's why we call it high performance and large scale. So in the end, you would force the file system to have 500,000 plus new files created at once now at the almost same seconds. It may vary in the milliseconds. One core is faster than the other. Some other has some load balance issue, okay, being at 1 minute later. But still, the file system is still dealing with having 400,000 files created. So 500,000 files at the whole for a file system to create at once is a scalability issue that usually file systems cannot really take and doing in this type of way. And with this, basically, your application will slow down. It cannot keep track with the storing of files and things like this. And with this, your overall performance of the application is, of course, blocked, because usually you don't really want to continue if your immediate status is not filed to disks, or let's say you don't want to really finish the application if your results are not, pulled to disks, because in the end, you don't compute for fun. You want to have the results. You want to have the data. And if the data not coming through, not follow through, then basically your overall application performance, even if the computing was excellent, doesn't help, because you have to wait on I/O. And that's why the I/O is so crucial and an extremely important part of your parallel application. So hence, parallel I/O to the rescue. You have a shared file where, let's say, everybody can write in this file. And that's why we say it's basically this collective operation into a file. You have still these different processes that do their computing, but the I/O is shared via this kind of logical file we discussed before. It's a collective operation where you do this MPI I/O. And of course, now an interesting scalability and performance part in it is essentially how you do the data layout with this file. And of course, still, let's be honest, when we have many different processes, can still create contention for the file system if they're doing all of that at once. But the shared file means also that all of them have their own portion. So usually it scales much better than essentially having this kind of serial I/O that we discussed before, or this parallel I/O with local I/O. And this shared file is usually the most scalable solution you can get. And on top of it, given MPI I/O as a standard, it's really a standardized way of doing it. And we will also learn this in one of our assignments. So an example of doing this, although I have to say the practicals also in lecture 5 and your assignment 2, which is coming up, we'll actually foster that in much more detail. You see here that we, of course, have to have a file handle. We can basically have some sort of information about a file that is interesting, essentially just key value pairs and so on about metadata. But then the name of the output file in the basically file system. And then you would create this file that you basically want to create in the MPI space. You have an MPI file open and some options where you say in which communicator. This would be always important. So you here think about the broadcast and reduce operations. You see the MPI file open is in a way very similar to this collective operation specifying a communicator. I don't want to have the single destination source anymore where I want to read and write files and so on. Then basically I have a file name. I say basically create it and the mode I want to access it, and then I get a certain file handle back. By having this file handle and then doing work here with different ranks and so on, it doesn't matter. You can have certain ways of writing into a file like ordered here, which would be rank ordered into a sort of buffer and using the file handler for it. or you just simply write to the file, basically not really considering the rank order, although this might be helpful for understanding the output file. But this, of course, would enable as fast as possible, so the people, the processes being ready as fast as possible in writing to file. And finally, we would close the file. That's what you do in a typical C operation. When you do opening files with a file handle, you also would do release, basically this certain file handle as well. And the interesting thing is, now what that enables, and that goes orthogonal, what you see here is it is binary. We write a binary file. The computer computes binary. And basically with this, we are in an operation with parallel I/O, which enables us to write binary, and with this also being capable of having high performance, because we don't want to have it really maybe investigated by a human that needs a non-binary version, because we all are not really all looking at, basically binary outputs usually. And this enables a whole sorts of possibilities where it really now goes from a, let's say, you would say 3-layer problem to a much more broader perspective, where you basically have the parallel file system that you enable as a hardware source, really now with the kind of I/O middleware with MPI into a certain bigger story about the whole I/O process. It matters what parallel file system you use. It matters what I/O software use, MPI-O, for instance, the MPI implementation. And then, of course, you have high-level I/O libraries, which are incredibly important in the application space. And we have to talk about this, which are usually formats like netcdf or the hierarchical data format, although in these days, these standards are more and more merged to do. And of course, this enables you with much more details, which we also will allude to in lecture 5 in different applications. And one application we will look deeper into is this HBDB scan. We already learned a lot now dealing with clustering of different data items, where of course now the question remains, if you want to do parallel I/O, we talked about 512 processes here for an example. And then we have the tail of how we drop this to file and how we basically drop the cluster identities to all these different files, which we're usually able to create maybe for each data item. Of course, we don't want to do this. Instead, we want to have, let's say, one logical file covering all of this domain, still identifying how all of these different points here have a cluster identity, which is different from the others. And this would be something in lecture 5, and also in subsequent lectures we will talk about, that this here, parallel I/O with different standards like the HDF5 hierarchical data format in the version 5 will make a big difference to your applications. But this was already more conceptually that MPI can do much more than you thought it could be with send and receivers and this little bit of broadcast, reduce, and so on. It has much more derivatives, and of course with this also the I/O significantly chimps in the game, as you learned hopefully from this basically second part of the lecture. But I liked essentially this video a little bit. That's why I will play it. It shows you a little bit the bottleneck of I/O. No matter how brilliant you are in parallel computing, parallel I/O is always something you have to look in either way, because you want to store your results. You want to basically analyze these results, or maybe reuse the results even in some in some subsequent applications. So in the end, parallel I/O is our twin, basically something we always have to think about, to think when we do parallel performance. And I think the video makes a good case for it. right. So ignore a little bit this kind of money consideration here. And also, of course, I'm not paid by DataCore, but I think the illustrations here, particularly of this nice illustration of the parallel I/O versus serial I/O here, I hope it gave you an insight that parallel I/O is, of course, a very strong part in all of this. Because in the end, if you compute very fast and you still always wait on I/O, it doesn't really bring to high performance of the overall application what we are interested in. So that's all what we basically have here today. Lecture 5 continues with some of these aspects, also then with more practical insights. So see you then.